Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's Creative Commons Open Culture Live webinar. It's entitled Open Culture in the Age of AI, Concerns, Hopes, and Opportunities. My name is Brigitte Vizna. I'm the Director of Policy and Open Culture at Creative Commons, and I'm really pleased to introduce this webinar, which will be moderated by Jocelyn Miara, who's CC's Open Culture Manager. And together we work at Creative Commons to promote open culture and better sharing of cultural heritage. This is the 5th webinar in our Open Culture Live series. The series aims to provide a space for conversations like this one around the key issues that arise in open culture. All our webinars are recorded and they're all available from our YouTube channel. I'll share the link in the chat in a moment. So today's topic is a hot one, to say the least. Artificial intelligence, especially generative artificial intelligence, is top of mind as our community continues to grapple with this emerging technology, what it means for creators, for the commons, for open sharing in general. And from the multiple conversations that we've had with community members, we know that there are a wide variety of views and certainly no simple answers. So this conversation will focus on open culture, and even more specifically on open heritage and the issues that cultural heritage institutions like museums, libraries, archives, they encounter in the face of AI. So it also touches on some of the artists' perspectives using AI in connection with heritage materials. And so we've structured the conversation into two main buckets. The first one has to do with how AI might support institutions on the inside. So for example, how can it help automate, improve processes like metadata generation or digital decay detection? How can it enhance access and discovery? These sorts of issues. And the second bucket is how can institutions, as the stewards of vast amounts of data, can make responsible decisions around access to their collections for the purposes of AI training. How can those decisions be made in line with their public service mission? And this conversation also relates to Creative Commons endeavors regarding preference signals. We're exploring these as a suite of new tools to be created that would reflect creators' preferences, so their wishes, regarding whether and how their content could be used for AI training. So the question is, could preference signals also find applications in the world of cultural heritage institutions? That's something worth having more conversations about. And so here to help us shed light on these issues are 4 panelists, and I'd like to welcome all of you. You'll be more fully introduced in a few moments, but here with us are Suzanne Duncan, Mine Atairu, Bart Meletti, and Michael Trisna. I'll pass over to you now, Jocelyn, to introduce them more fully and guide us through the conversation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bridget. Really excited to have this conversation with you all today. So I'll introduce each of the panelists one by one, and they'll introduce themselves a bit, and then we'll get into a conversation. We'll leave 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. So if you have questions along the way, please remember them. Feel free to pop them in the chat, and then we can get to them at the end. So first, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Duncan. Suzanne is the Chief Operating Officer at Tehiku Media and works for her tribal media and organization in the far north of Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Indigenous organization not only holds and cares for a significant archive of Maori language data, but has also been developing natural language processing tools using AI and machine learning to promote the revitalization of language. Suzanne, go ahead.
Oh, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everybody. It is only just morning here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So if you see me yawn, please know it's nothing to do with you at all. So our little organization, we're a small media organization. We started over 30 years ago as a radio station. We were born out of the Māori rights movement. So during the sort of 1980s, where Māori were a colonized Indigenous people, were saying, actually, no, we've kind of had enough, and we would like, in particular, we would love to revitalize our language, which had our native speakers had significantly dropped. And so our radio station came from this movement. And over the last 30 years, we've collected an archive of amazing Māori language speakers. And in the last 10 years, our organisation has really started thinking a lot about data sovereignty. How do we share this 30-something years worth of archives with our community so that they're able to benefit from all of that, while also keeping it safe? And so we built our own platform that we were able to share our beautiful archive out to the 86% of our tribal members that don't live in our region, so can't just turn on the radio. But we built one so that we weren't sharing our beautiful archives out into the world via other platforms such as YouTube and Facebook, where we know you do sort of lose a bit of control over that data and what happens with it. And then more recently again, we began to build our own tools. The first automatic speech recognition for Te Reo Māori, our first synthesized voice, a number of tools to promote our language. And I think we've been quite proud about the way that we've done this, the way that we've been able to collect data to do that in a way that we think is really respectful and responsible to other Indigenous languages, all Indigenous kind of data. So really looking forward to the rest of the conversation this morning. Nō reira, tēnā koutou.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Mina Ateru, an interdisciplinary artist and doctoral student in the Art and Education program at Teachers College at Columbia University. Mina is a researcher and interdisciplinary artist interested in generative artificial intelligence, utilizing AI-mediated processes and materials. Ateru's work critically examines and illustrates understudied gaps in Black historical archives. Mina's academic research focuses on generative AI, art, and educational policy in urban K-12 art classrooms.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jocelyn. So as Jocelyn mentioned, I'm an interdisciplinary artist and I use generative AI in two ways, right? One, I'm interested in how generative AI systems encode and visualize concepts related to Blackness. So whether it's Black lives, Black cosmologies, Black geographies, but I'm also interested in using generative AI to understand absences and gaps in traditional archives, most of which are used to populate data sets for model training. So what I want to do is share my screen to talk about, find my slide. So I wanted to share this work series I've been working on since 2020. It's titled Igun, and it's based on the Benin bronzes. For folks who are not too familiar with the Benin bronzes, they are a collection of looted objects stolen from Nigeria by the British colonial government in 1897. About 4,000 or over 4,000 of them were stolen from Nigeria in 1897. They were then exported to England, where they were distributed and sold to various museums and private collectors. So right now we know about 160 museums worldwide have at least one object from the stolen collection. So I was very interested in what happened to the artistic landscape after this theft in Benin for two reasons, right? One, prior to the colonial theft, art making in Benin was very much predicated by authorization from the king. So if you're an artist and you were going to make work, whether it's made of bronze or any other imported material, you would need the king's authorization to do so, because he had this foreign imported material, particularly bronze as a material, was stored in his palace. So in order to access that raw material, you needed his permission for them to take it out of his storage. But with colonialism and with the British invasion, the king was ousted, he was exiled from Benin. So I was very interested in how artists sort of reorganized their artistic practice, what they made when they no longer had a king, what they made when they no longer had access to the raw materials that they traditionally had for generations, because artistic practice was a hereditary practice that had existed for centuries, right? And so how did colonization disrupt, but also change that landscape? So one thing I was interested in was to learn what artists had made when they had no king. What kind of forms were they visualizing? What kind of materials were they using for 17 years? Because we had no king for 17 years. It's considered the interregnum era. So far, I haven't really found any object that speaks to what was made during that period. And so as an artist, I was very interested then who is working with generative systems in using a generative model known as StyleGAN, which is a machine learning model that you can customize with your own data set. And so for my data set, I used the collection of objects that were stolen from Benin, specifically objects that exist right now in museum collections, and some of which are on the screen. You can see them. These are images that were captured like right after the invasion of Benin. But I just wanted to show you some samples of works I have created based on these the data set. So here is one of my early prototypes. The work exists in the form of prototypes. So what I do is I train models in response to what has changed in response to development in the field, right? So this is a model that was trained on StyleGAN 2. You can see it's an earlier model. It's not as photorealistic as what we have today. And here's another version of the StyleGAN model. But as AI continued to develop, we had the more recent ones that are a little bit more photorealistic. So you can see the texture, but it also answers the question of materials, right? What materials would artists have used during that time to make work? One thing I was exploring especially was a material that was indigenous to Benin, which is clay, because Benin has a lot of clay. So I did explore a lot with clay. Then we have more samples that are photorealistic. And then my more recent work, which is focused on text to 3D. So it isn't necessarily a trained or fine-tuned model. It's the beta version of a model that focuses on text to three-dimensional generation. And I'll just stop here. I feel like I've gone over my time.
Thanks so much for sharing, and those visuals are really wonderful. I'm looking forward to talking about all of this even more. Our next panelist is Bart Maletti, who is the head of knowledge and exchange at CREATE at the University of Glasgow. Bart works as the head of knowledge and exchange and the director of CREATE, the Center for Regulation and of the Creative Economy at the University of Glasgow. His research focuses on copyright law, the public domain, and exceptions. Bart has led the development of several digital resources intended to make copyright law accessible to everyone, such as copyrightuser.org and .eu. Bart, go ahead.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Jocelyn and Brigitte, for inviting me, and great to be part of this panel. So as Jocelyn just said, my research at the CREATE Center in Glasgow focuses on copyright law, and more specifically on the public domain and copyright exceptions. So basically, my work investigates what one can do with existing materials without having to get permission from the copyright owner. And in addition to that, yes, part of my job is also to translate research findings into accessible guidance for creators and other copyright users like cultural heritage institutions. So that, I guess, is the main perspective from which I will contribute to this panel discussion. So as you may know, copyright law is relevant for the development and use of AI technology. It's potentially one of the main legal obstacles to the development of AI models. It's, as Brigitte said, it's AI is a hot topic also in the copyright world. There are a lot of questions being debated, and most of which can be grouped as either relating to the input of AI models or the output. So, for example, in relation to the output, a key question is whether work generated by AI can or should attract copyright protection. And then in relation to the input of generative AI models, there is the question of whether training AI models with copyright works requires permission from the copyright owners or not. But then I think there is also another set of questions which is not specifically about generative AI, but I think is also very relevant for cultural heritage institutions and their public mission, which is how copyright law shapes the use of AI technology to analyze large amounts of copyright works, of collections for research purposes, which is what I'm personally interested in. And so the answer to those questions really varies depending to whom you ask the question and where. And so I'll stop there. I'll be happy to discuss these in more detail if you're interested. But yeah, thanks again for inviting me and looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much. And our last panelist is Mike Trisna. Mike works as a data scientist in the Smithsonian Institution Data Science Lab. Mike collaborates with researchers, curators, and collection specialists from many museums and research units of the Smithsonian. He's also focused on building data science and AI literacy within the organization and leads the Smithsonian Carpentries Group and co-manages the Smithsonian AI Interest Group. I'll hand it over to Mike.
All right, thank you so much. So I wanted to give a quick overview of what I do and also how that fits into the two buckets that Brigitte mentioned earlier. So she talked about how cultural heritage institutions are using AI and then also producing data that is acting as the foundation for a lot of the AI models that are out there. I mostly fall into that first bucket as a data scientist, where working with researchers and curators, staff, I think is the general term, I guess, for anyone that I'm working with at units around the Smithsonian. We have 21 museums, 9 research centers, many libraries, archives, and a zoo at the Smithsonian. So there are people working on all kinds of different topics. And we have huge collections, and we're working to incorporate AI into existing workflows. So people are kind of helping people do what they're already doing. They're the experts in their fields, but do that with a little bit of extra help and extra insight that AI can provide in a lot of cases. So some specific examples that we've been working on recently, specifically that pertain to generative AI. We've been using some open source actual audio transcription models to transcribe audio recordings, and then also in the accessibility realm to help produce visual descriptions for images, so that every time you see an image on a website, it's supposed to have an alt text description, and we have millions and millions of images. So to produce those, we're looking at using AI to help with that. So that's an important point there, that for all of these use cases, even though you may read these press releases from AI companies saying that they're 99% accurate, as a cultural heritage organization such as the Smithsonian, one of our biggest benefits is we are seen as an organization of trust. If we put something out there, even if it's I guess alongside something from our collections, it's an inaccurate audio transcription or inaccurate visual description for an image, it really harms our reputation. And there's a lot of risk in that. So for all of these applications, we're trying really hard to make sure that we have the experts involved in these processes. Our group also put together with some other researchers and interested people around the Smithsonian, we put together an AI value statement, kind of looking at, like, AI is coming more and more into everyone's practices. what are the values we can look for in incorporating AI across the board. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that the AI models that we're using don't have any biases, or at least we know what they are. And this was produced, we put this together before ChatGPT came out, these large language models, which are pretty opaque. You cannot see what the data sets that they were trained on. So it's really important to keep all these things in mind. And as I guess, getting into the kind of the consumer, the producer end of producing data for large language models, Smithsonian has a large open access collection, and we are trying to kind of, when we put out our data sets, we want to make sure that even though they are put out there in Creative Commons 0 license, that we have additional value statements that Brigitte kind of mentioned, that we say, like, please use these things respectfully. Please provide any feedback on anything that you see that's that needs correcting. That's kind of like the feedback loop that you get from open access. I'll stop there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. So I'm going to do some administrative work to get you all pinned so everyone can watch you. And at the same time, I'd like to ask my first question, which is, just in your day-to-day, or sort of maybe in your job description or your work, how has generative AI and the introduction of generative AI changed what you do and your work?
I mean, I can go first. I mean, it hasn't changed my, well, I mean, my sort of day-to-day work a lot. It has changed in the sense that I do get a lot of questions about copyright and generative AI. But yeah, I don't personally use generative AI tools, I think, for any of the work I do. But yeah, I do provide guidance on the copyright aspects. As I said, it's become a really trendy topic in the copyright arena. What I do experience more from a practical point of view is the use of AI technology for research purposes, and in the UK, the legal difficulties that researchers encounter to do that. So basically, to do the carry out the kind of uses that Mike described, like transcribing large collections of works, for example, for accessibility or research purposes. While that should be permitted, I mean, is permitted by law, researchers still encounter difficulties from a practical point of view, because if they approach the right holders to get permission to do that, they often get a no. Or if they approach their own legal counsel, their university, they also usually find a risk-averse approach. So yeah, that, I think, is how AI is affecting my work. Yeah.
I'm very much the same. So it hasn't really changed the way that we work in our organization. Only that now people want us to build one. So currently they perform quite poorly on our language. I mean, New Zealand's population is like less than 1% of the world's population, and in Aotearoa, Māori represent a small proportion of that, and Māori language speakers are much smaller. So our language isn't a big language, and therefore a lot of the data sets haven't been used very well to train these generative AI models. What it has done as well, I think, is because of the kind of hype around them, that they can do all of these things, it's created quite a lot of sort of, I guess, pressure for smaller organizations like ours that are very careful around data sovereignty and what we use and how we share our data. It's put a lot of pressure for people to say, oh, well, you should build one for us, but equally at the same time, why don't you just use ChatGPT? Why don't you just use the ones that are out there? Because, big tech's going to save us, and big tech's going to do it for us. So, yeah, if anything, it's just made it quite disruptive at the moment for us. But also the opportunities that exist with that type of technology. It's about trying to navigate, how do we best utilize it? How can we create models that can actually do specific tasks rather than being this kind of strange thing that does everything for everyone, has been an exciting part of the new technology emerging.
And I'll follow on to what Suzanne said there to say that I think generative AI has made AI a little bit more approachable for non-experts. So I mean, when I first started in this position, I really had to be a little bit of an evangelist about how AI can make your life easier. I had to convince people of that, and now it's totally the opposite. I'm getting more requests than I can possibly handle. But I think there's a lot of value in that. I think a lot of the, I'm going to call it traditional work that I was doing as a data scientist to do things like natural language processing, where you're like, there are certain tasks like trying to pull names out of large texts, or derive meaning or summaries from text and things like that you had to build large custom data sets, train custom models, and now you can copy paste that into ChatGPT and ask it, and it will give you a pretty reasonable answer. So I think being able to test these things out and use these as approachable tools, I think has a lot of value, and being able to show people what they can do with their data to enhance it further.
I think for me, my practice is based on AI, so I don't know if it has changed, but I think keeping up with the velocity at which, developments are happening is a thing for all of us. So understanding the capabilities and limitations of every model, right, that's released. But also importantly for me is the question of ethics, right? One thing I think about very often is this question of sometimes you might appropriate, even as a Black person, ideas that you don't necessarily understand fully. And there is this ability to do that very easily with AI. Now, with a few words, 5 words, you can wield anything into existence. And so what are the questions about ethics and appropriation and all these questions that continue to exist in the traditional art world that have been transferred to this space?
Great. That's a really wonderful transition into the next question that I was going to ask. So many artists and creators are frustrated to learn that their work has been ingested into AI models as training data for training purposes. And I'm wondering what your views on this are, both legally for the lawyers who are here, but also ethically, and how can there be a balance between having artists feel like they're gaining from these systems while they're also giving to them?
Yeah, should I go first again? I mean, is a really broad question from a copyright point of view, but yeah, I'll try to summarize it. So I can't really speak to the ethical aspects. I can speak to the legal and specifically the copyright law aspects. So here, I guess the key question is the one I mentioned earlier, whether training AI models with copyright protected works requires permission or not from the copyright owners. And there are several arguments there, and that are also, that also vary depending on the jurisdiction. So like one first argument is that a fundamental principle of copyright law is what is known as the idea expression dichotomy, according to which copyright only protects original expressions of ideas, not ideas themselves, and similarly does not protect facts, information, methods, techniques, which all belong to the public. So from that point of view, one could argue, training AI models doesn't really, convey the original expression to a new audience, and therefore does not require permission. But then, legislators in several jurisdictions have taken a different approach. They are introducing specific copyright exceptions to enable, the training of AI models and also the use of AI models for research purposes. Again, for example, in the UK, we do have one specific exception that allows you to text and data, to carry out a computational analysis of a large amount of works for non-commercial research purposes. So under that exception, one can probably use large amount of works to train generative AI models. In the EU, they also have an exception which is similar, is only for non-commercial research purposes, but then there is a broader one also for commercial purposes, but with an opt-out option, so where right holders can expressly reserve. So it can, with machine readable means, they can say, no, I don't want my work to be used for training. And then in the US, for example, there is the fair use doctrine, which probably covers the training of AI models. I mean, it has covered in the past, for example, the digitization of large collections of books to create full text searchable databases, and so the HathiTrust and the Google Books cases, they were considered fair use. So yeah, in the United States, I would say that it's very likely that training AI models with copyright works would be considered fair use, because it's transformative use. Although again, there are arguments against it as well, because generative AI, some argue, is different because also it generates a sort of an expression similar to those that are traditionally protected by copyright. So yeah, it's a difficult question, and really, again, as I said before, the answer changes depending on to whom you ask the question and where. I'll stop there for now. We can discuss it further.
Not a lawyer here, or have any real understanding of copyright law. But here, for our organization and for sort of, I guess, Māori Indigenous people of New Zealand, we have a concept called whakapapa, and the whakapapa is about genealogy. And so it's really important for us to recognize the genealogy of everything. And when it comes to AI models and the training of AI models and the data that's used for it, we have spend a lot of time and energy and effort understanding the genealogy of the data, the people that are in it, the people that are speaking, the relationships we have that relate to that data, so that we know how our model's been created, and the genealogy of our models. Then from that as well, we think about what's going to come from the model, so how that genealogy is going to carry on, and the responsibilities that we have as an organization for that kind of output, so the gain that you might be talking about for artists and creators. So we spend a lot of time and energy on that, and as an example of that, while we've created a lot of our own data through our archive, we have had to seek additional data, and we've not I guess, taken data that's freely available in the public domain. We've still gone and sought permission from those organizations, and we recently held our own webinar alongside our national radio broadcaster, Radio New Zealand, and Ngā Taonga Sound and Vision, which is our national sound archive, where we explained how our relationship was going to support the development of our models that we've been doing for training. So that was a 2-year relationship that we built to this point of giving a webinar to explain what we were doing. So there's a long genealogy in our relationship, because it's really important for us to respect all of the data, the way that it's used, what comes from it. And so while we understand that there's a lot to gain from it, there's lots of potential to gain, we can't do that at the expense of decades worth of relationships and decades worth of creators and their effort and their energy that they've put in to this data even existing in the first place. So not a legal perspective, but I guess what we'd like to say, not an LAW perspective, but an LORE perspective from our people.
And I'll put kind of a weird spin on, or maybe an unexpected spin on the answer to that question, in that the Smithsonian, it's part of our open access data set that we share under Creative Commons Zero license. We have over 5 million images that are free for anyone to use. You would think that, of course, this would be great for some of these generative AI models to pull up and use, and they are. But in slightly unexpected ways. So I think sort of this weird twist of Creative Commons zero licenses that anyone can use that image anywhere on the internet without any kind of attribution. So what I think has happened when we were able to inspect one of the only open source image data sets that's out there, because as Suzanne and Bart both mentioned, a lot of these are used or put together under fair use and are not shared openly on like what they train these generative AI models under. But anyways, there was a large one that had images and text descriptions. That's how you put together something that you can type a command into and produce an image. And we looked in there to see if we could find images from the Smithsonian Art Collection. We found them, but they were not coming from the Smithsonian. So it showed their source. They were coming from blog posts or social media or whatever, and their descriptions were a pretty painting or something like that. Whereas on our website, we have detailed descriptions written by curators and experts, but that wasn't what made it into those models. So I think I don't really know how to get ahead of that, maybe to actually make sure that we are like very clear about sharing these things as prepackaged digests that models are able, or AI companies, researchers, whatever else are able to pull those in to act as the authoritative source. But it's kind of a tricky subject, I think.
I guess I want to kind of focus on, I mean, I started out as a traditional artist and I went to art school. And so, but now I use generative AI, so I don't want to act like I can speak for traditional artists. But one thing I feel that comes up, especially for my friends who still remain in the traditional ecosystem, is the question of compensation, right? A lot of these AI companies are multi-billion-dollar corporations. So how do we implement mechanisms to compensate artists who choose to opt in to the system? It's not only saying, well, now you have a mechanism to opt out, but if you do opt in, how do you compensate these artists? After all, your CEO has a mansion somewhere, you know, in LA. And so I don't necessarily think that fair use should be an argument that we keep sort of propelling forward, but we all need to ensure that our artists who are just as valuable as the CEOs continue to make money from this system. And it feels like it's a vain thing, but you know, considering that most artists are struggling, it's important that we implement systems that ensure they are compensated.
Can I just quickly add to that? That's been a big part of our work as well, we get criticized quite a lot because we're not about necessarily really open data, particularly Indigenous Māori data. We're very much like, you know, try and protect it as much as possible because of our history and where we've ended up. We're not in a position to necessarily, and I don't want to use the word exploit, but to harness our own data for our own purposes. You know, only 4% of our technology, people that work in technology in New Zealand are Māori. So we've got a long way to go in terms of growing our capacity and capability in the space. And so it seems to really only be benefiting. I mean, sure, we're getting these cool tools and apps and things, but the people that are really benefiting are not our community. A lot of other people are making quite a lot of money off of our data, and none of it seems to be pouring back in to our community to support our aspirations and our goals. So yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Wonderful, thank you. So I think that leads to sort of one of the questions I have and one of the subjects of this panel, which is concerns. What are some of your biggest concerns around generative AI as it impacts cultural heritage?
I'm just going to jump in while I have energy. It's 2:45. So one of our biggest concerns and what we're seeing happening with generative AI models here in Aotearoa for our language specifically, so looking at how it's impacting on Māori culture and Māori language, is because it's not a big, because they don't do it very well, people are taking these models as an authority on our language because everyone's like, so great, these models are so good, they're so accurate. Often they are being benchmarked on data sets. You know, the sort of popular data sets that people are benchmarking these things against are actually really poor. If you have a look at what's there, they're not actually great for our language. And so what is happening is people are seeing them as an authority. Sort of going to what you were saying, Mike, you know, these amazing pieces of artwork or historical objects have like this quite bizarre or you know, not that informative or authoritative title or explanation of what they are or where they've come from. Our language is being represented really poorly. The language is very narrow, so it doesn't have, so some translation models that are out there created by generative AI for our language, the translations are very basic because it's very narrow, because the vocabulary isn't there, the cultural context isn't there, the Māori mind has not been part of the creation of these translations. And so the real concern for us is that this is going to have a really large impact on the future of the language because it's going to be so narrow and it's going to be, and then are we all going to start sounding the same, and how the translations that go, they're all going to be you know, coming from these models. So we have a real concern about the genuine impact of this on the future of our language. We're still in a growth revitalization phase, right? We've still got loads and loads of learners coming into the space, and they're using these models as a tool, which is cool, but then they're also taking them as absolutely true and bypassing people that have been doing it for years and that hold that cultural knowledge. So when it's going back to the relationship agreement that we've created with our archive and Radio New Zealand, when we put out the webinar to explain what we were doing, two big questions came in. The first was around pecuniary gain. As you know, as Te Hiku Media, we're going to start building a huge compound on an island in Hawaii for us and our kids to play in the beach. We'll start firing things off into space. No, but, and the second was around machine translation and generative translation. People really didn't want us to because they've just seen how poor it is. And they're just really concerned about the impact this is going to have long term on our culture and our language. Taking it back a few sort of decades where we were trying to just get people talking Māori, but now we're at this really exciting phase where we're excited about the diversity of our languages and the different tribes and the different words that they use, concerned that these generative models are going to be very narrow, and people are just going to take them as, and because we've seen it, unfortunately, over the years where people have used the G Translate, and that's become like the name of their shop or their organization, or they've used the translation in official documents, and they've been completely incorrect because these big companies have trusted names and trusted brands by people. So yeah, that's a really significant concern for us, and also why we really advocate for projects in this space, particularly small Indigenous languages, to be led by those communities and not by large multinationals.
What other concerns do we have?
I think one that I can think of, and this is coming from, I guess, a place of privilege at the Smithsonian, is a possible inequality that can come from the amount of resources and expertise that are sometimes required to engage with generative AI in a responsible way. Like I said, we're very lucky at the Smithsonian that we already have a lot of funds dedicated to research. My group helps run the high performance compute cluster at the Smithsonian, so we're able to pull in some of these open access large language models and do things, try things out internally, train our own models, things like that, and get around some of these. I know hallucinations are like a real concern. some of the ways of getting around hallucinations are to produce your own databases of knowledge bases that you can draw on. It's not something that everyone can do. So I think that I'm a little worried that only the cultural heritage institutions that have resources to do these types of things and may produce some sort of gap. But on the other hand, I think in an earlier answer, I said that generative AI is making certain aspects of AI more approachable. So it kind of remains to be seen how that will all shake out.
Yes, for me, I work with, so for my Eagle project, I work with a data set of objects that were stolen from Nigeria. And I think I've recently become very much interested in the ways in which, communities who've had their cultural property stolen, especially during the colonial era, how do they opt in or opt out from, machine learning or data scrapes online? Because especially for objects that are still under being contested or not yet returned to those communities, right? Do we have the option to say, okay, hold off on letting OpenAI scrape our data until this has been resolved or not? And so that's one thing I've been thinking about, one concern I have.
And yeah, I guess my concerns are sort of follow on what Mike said, which is the I don't know how to phrase it, but the difficulty to make the most out of these technologies for a lot of institutions and groups. So there are like both infrastructural challenges. You need a lot of processing power and machines that like even large universities often don't have in-house. They need to pay again large tech companies to to enable those services. And I think like a similar argument can be made from a legal point of view. Like even what sort of concerns me personally is that in the lobbying around copyright and AI, there are a lot of arguments against big tech corporations, which are very legitimate. But then, as we've seen in the past, the result of that often is like the introduction of new rights or extended protection that doesn't really affect the operation of the big tech corporation. Who actually gets affected are the smaller players. Like they create like new barriers to enter the market for smaller companies and a lot of new regulation to comply with for researchers or smaller cultural heritage institution. So I guess that is one concern from my perspective.
Thank you. So adding to that, we've learned in conversation actually with Hugging Face, an AI company, that AI models can often exacerbate inequalities in representation. So we were given the example that if 7 out of 10 images of nurses that are input into an AI model are women, that 9 out of 10 times the image generated of nurse would be a woman. And so this is obviously concerning in terms of representation of diversity. How can we balance the desire for this representation with the concern that AI may be extracting from disenfranchised people and communities?
Have them build it. So that's kind of our approach. We've found, a big part of the work that we do is growing capacity and capability of Māori and Pacific Island people in the tech space, so that we're very much part of leading the development of these models. We're actually building them ourselves, and we're asking those questions all the time. What are our models doing? What are they saying? The Māori language doesn't our pronouns are generally gender neutral, and so we're always testing these things. We have benchmarks specific to the things that we want to know, things that we have concerns about. So when we're testing our model, we're asking that question. We're saying, what are you saying? Are you biased in this space? Are you accurately representing the way that we think as a culture? So that we're creating models that don't just reproduce things that they actually can reproduce, offensive or biased ideas, colonial ideas. So what you're seeing sometimes with a lot of these models is because they've been built by a primarily male and white group of people, that the basis of those models is a lot of some of those thoughts. So yeah, a big thing for us is that we build them, create more diversity in your organizations, ensure that those people are part of your benchmarking and your testing, so that they can ask those questions, so they can, because they are thinking about them and experiencing them. So yeah, that's how I think we should approach it.
Yeah, I agree with Suzanne that for any time you actually intend to release anything that generative AI touched at all, I think you've got to get so many eyes on it, expert opinions on first of all, on if you're using data that was produced with it, to assess it from multiple different angles. But then what really scares me is when people I guess make models directly available to the public. So you see, I don't know, anytime we do like a brainstorming session on how you can use generative AI, everyone immediately comes up with the chatbot idea, like how you can chat with a specific figure or some chat with Smithsonian specific data. But there's I feel like I see a different news article every single day about how a chatbot has gone wrong, how people have used it for the wrong things, to get it to say bad things. And you can put safeguards around there, you can try to, but people always find a way. So I think it's important, I think, to take a step back, to really focus on AI literacy, to have people, I think, really hard about like what are the worst things that can happen. Like I mentioned before, I think all of us have talked about it. The strength of our cultural heritage organizations are the trust, the reputations that we have, and immediately, I think in any kind of application, you can think of like, how could our reputation be harmed by the output of some model or some application? So I think thinking through like a risk framework, there are great risk frameworks out there. The NIST in the US has put one out. It's gigantic. It's many hundred pages PDF, but the Library of Congress in the US has put together their own internal framework, which is basically an interpretation of the NIST one. That's really helpful to read through, and really makes you think before you are going to apply AI, like what are the worst things that can happen, and then not only that, like put the brakes on, but like how can you get the right people involved in your organization or outside your organization, or the people who know that data, to ensure that you are getting the right answers, the right outputs, and that you're using them correctly.
I think for me, I'm very interested in like domain specific systems. So systems that have been fine-tuned with a data set that's tailored to, say, a specific culture, right? And given my focus also on, Black lives and Black communities, I'm also interested in the internal dynamics, because Blackness is kaleidoscopic in nature, right? And so even within communities, there are various hierarchies and issues of questions of ethics that we need to consider, right? So for example, if we are fine-tuning a system that's focused on hip hop culture in Chicago is very distinct from hip hop culture in the Bronx, right? And so how do you train or design a system that's tailored for various communities, but also considering domain experts? And then there's also the question of value locking, which means, our values change over time. And so how do we design dynamic systems that respond to the values? We value X about hip hop, in 2024, we don't value that in 2025. And so how do we build a system that changes over time too? Those are things I'm thinking about.
And I mean, this is a really complex topic. And again, I can only contribute from my niche area of expertise. I would say that, from another consideration from a copyright point of view is that, too much copyright protection can also contribute to the development of biased and unethical AI models. So take, for example, copyright duration, which is very long. In most countries, copyright is protected for the life of the author plus 70 years. So say if one couldn't rely on exceptions to train algorithm, like a risk-averse cultural institution may decide, okay, let's only develop, algorithm based on AI models based on out of copyright collections. So we're talking about really old works that, of course, come with more bias. So I guess, yeah, that's another relevant consideration from a copyright point of view.
Thank you. And what do you all see as the applications for generative AI in cultural heritage institutions, mostly focusing on the near future? Like, what do you see happening in the next few years around generative AI and cultural heritage institutions? I might call on Mike for this one.
Yeah, this is a good question. And I don't know about the others, but I definitely hesitate to answer because I feel like I can't even predict a week or a month in the future. It seems like I'm surprised constantly by, I don't know, I in the AI literacy aspect of my job, I try and help tell people what are the things that you can and can't do with AI, and what you can't do part of AI. It feels like I have to keep on constantly revising because the field is developing so quickly. So I hope to see. It feels like as if there was this kind of like quick um, um, rapid progression in large language models since when ChatGPT was first released, that it seemed like they were going to keep on getting better. Everyone was like, they're going to get so good every month that they're going to start taking jobs. There's definitely concern about that. But it feels like they're sort of plateauing a bit in that they're running out of data to train on. And there's a turn now towards high quality data rather than quantity of data, which is where I think our organizations can contribute. I mean, they may have already trained on our data already, but I think being able to filter, to accentuate, to get to curate essentially, which is what what our organizations do, to curate that data and get input in that way to make sure that trusted, valid data is what gets fed into these models to make them better.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. It's very hard, it's very hard to predict what's coming. I think for us here in Aotearoa and for our small organization and cultural heritage institutions that hold Māori data, I guess what we'll probably see is, and I'm hopeful about it, is that at least we're going to have better access. So it's going to be easier to find. And because at the moment it's just impossible to find. It's just so, there's so much that's just so unknown about actually what's held by a lot of our institutions. So potentially, it's going to make it easier for us to find the stuff, and then therefore hopefully, support the revitalization of our culture and things for our communities. What I'm also hoping to see, and what I think Mike sort of touched on, is around trust, and I think maybe the community demanding that these models are a bit more transparent about what they've been trained on and how they've been trained and how well they actually perform. And so I think there might be sort of a rise in the development of very specific benchmarking tests and benchmarking tests that actually support communities, their actual benchmarks, so that we will start to see perhaps some of these models actually being validated by the community. And so, Māori will be able to say, hey, this one's really great for this for us, but it doesn't do very well here. This one, they're not telling us where they got any of their data from. And so, I just feel like there's going to be this sort of shift where people are like, yes to this one, no to this one, yes, this is great, no, this isn't. And it's going to be sort of based on community standards and community expectations rather than sort of, I guess, popular benchmarking sets that I talked about earlier. And I think that's quite exciting. Like, I think, it's going to be great that we start actually demanding this ourselves, and sort of putting a bit of pressure on, saying, well, actually, our expectation is that you would perform better than you currently are. So yeah, that's yeah. But in terms of, gosh, what the technology itself might be doing, I've got no idea.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna pass on this one. I don't work in an institution, so I probably don't have the best answer.
Yeah, no problem. Fine for folks to pass. I have one more question and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So feel free if you have questions to start dropping them in the chat and I'll read them out. And I'll also let folks unmute and ask their questions themselves if they want to do that. So my last question is, what are some of your biggest hopes and wishes around generative AI in the future?
I mean, for me, very simply, I really hope that researchers in particular, can make the most out of those tools and carry out useful research in the public interest without copyright law being an obstacle to that. So yeah, that's my hope.
I think for me, certainly implementing a compensation mechanism, not just for artists, but for all of us, because we all contribute our data sets in various ways, whether it's the image you post on Instagram, right? And so how do we all benefit from this progress that humanity is making? And so we're not having this, we're not having this meeting here to amplify an organization and embolden some people and sort of line the pockets of a few, but that the wealth is distributed from this progress.
Absolutely, I support that. And I hope that we can start to see those benefits, compensation, contribution, being made into our communities like ours that have suffered incredibly, and who are, sort of starting at the bottom of the mountain when it comes to being able to take advantage of a lot of this technology. That's some of it gets to support our youth, our rangatahi, here in Aotearoa, to create space for them in this exciting sector. And that we can grow a sort of whole generation of Māori, Indigenous, amazing people that can contribute into the space and change the landscape of what AI technology looks like. So yeah, I've got a lot of big hopes, and I think I shared a few throughout everything that I've talked about, but that's a real hope for us, is that our young people can really start to grow into this sector.
Yeah, my hope is that I think, as the others have said, that generative AI gets a little bit better about attribution, credit, possibly compensation for where its answers or results are coming from. I think in a lot of ways it's a technological problem. It's a very weird technology that I've seen it described sometimes as an alien technology, that they suddenly produced this thing that was able to produce answers. They're not exactly sure why. So I think we've been spending in the AI research world, a lot of effort has gone into, like, why does it answer certain question in this way, what is the data that it's actually drawing on to produce that answer? And there are my hopes, to get back to the question, are that they get better at that. They're able to kind of like give attributions directly to where these things came from and spot biases, gaps in knowledge, and things like that. And that partnerships work towards that. Partnerships with the data sources help towards that end.
Bart, did we get your answer on that one? I might have missed. I might have hopes and wishes.
Yes, I did say about the researchers being able to do the research, but yeah, I completely agree also what others said just now. And I think, I mean, again, not from a copyright point of view, but just as a citizen, well, as an educator, I think it's, like the ability to interrogate AI on why they answer certain questions certain way, I think is key, really. So there's a big debate in education also about whether, students should be allowed or not to use ChatGPT to write their essays. And, there are a lot of, people who think that they, try to sort of prohibit it at the moment. My personal view is that it's sort of inevitable. It's just another tool out there that, will be used, and increasingly so. So I think it's about, using those tools again, ethically and respectfully and lawfully. And, even in education, I think is not the right way forward. It's not really to prohibit the use of these tools, but to, develop these tools in a way that they can be interrogated and can be used as, research tools as you currently use, a search engine, for example.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. So we have a few audience questions in the chat, and again, please feel free to add more. The first one that I saw was, how can we take a rights rather than a risk-based approach? How can the CARE principles inform our AI practice and regulation? And I'll drop those CARE principles in the chat for anyone who's unfamiliar.
I don't feel like I can be an authority on this, but so I definitely defer that second part of the question, but I wanted to respond to this because I think it came right after I talked about like a risk-based approach to AI, and I want to clarify that that's not all, of course. So risk, I feel like maybe I overused it, talking about reputational risk. And the reason why we want to preserve that is because you lose that once, and everything in the future, no matter what you're doing, is tainted from then on. So I absolutely agree that the CARE principles are important as well. I think we all talked a lot about working with the people who are affected by the data, so that it's not extractive, so that you are working with communities around the world, wherever. I mean, I'm not the authority from the Smithsonian, but I know that there is work being done to work with communities where specimens are coming from, collections objects, whether we should even have those, as many mentioned. There's a lot of work being done in that right now. So I'll leave it as that, at that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the CARE principles are great. For us, a big part, like what I've shared already today, is around responsibility. So it's not enough for us to just build it, right? We take a lot of responsibility for then what it goes on to do. So, as an example, people really don't want the translation thing, but another thing, so we've created a Māori synthetic voice. So a text-to-speech model for our language. We sort of just randomly built a bit of a prototype, and we're like, well, this is really cool. Not really understanding at the time the kind of the potential applications. And since then, we've been approached by accessibility organizations, and in particular, one of our own relations, one of our own people who is nonverbal. So she has cerebral palsy, and she can't talk, and she uses a device to speak. And she she doesn't have a Maori voice to speak. So she was fluent in our language, but her voice had an Australian accent and couldn't pronounce our language. And so it was horrible. I just, just aroha. I felt just absolute aroha for this young woman who wasn't actually able to speak our language properly because of the device that she had. So we've created a synthetic voice that she could use. And we've been really excited about that. But we've also had a lot of questions from people saying, like, oh, so if you were just to put that out, could people then use it to say things that we might not say in Te Reo Māori or from our Māori cultural perspective, things that we would find really, really offensive. And so that's had us stop for a moment, not so much in the work with our relation there, but in general about putting out a Māori language model voice synthesis, because we take a lot of responsibility for what our tools may then go on to do, that kind of extension of the genealogy of things, if it's going to go on and cause harm. And so we have to sit down and have these quite deep philosophical conversations and speak to our old people about what we do. So for us, responsibility and accountability to our community is really, really important, because we don't want to destroy the trust that we've created as a 30-something care organization. And we want to be able to demonstrate the power of us leading these conversations and leading this work. So yes, love the care principles. Fantastic. I think I think actually when you click through that link, it goes to the Indigenous data governance care principles as well, which are really important.
Wonderful, thank you. So another question we have, can you suggest any references about protecting from hoax information or sort of false information? I don't know if any of you feel like you have perspectives or expertise around this.
I mean, I want to, like, I'm thinking of this question in relation to watermarking and maybe AI watermarking. If, tools like DALL-E 3 and a lot of other text image generators have an imperceptible watermark in the images that, are visible, that you can use to like sort of, if you have a software you can use to detect if it was AI generated or not. So that's what's coming to mind. But in terms of, the space of, say, text generation, there aren't as many watermarking tools. There are no foolproof watermarking tools for text generation. So we don't know that, the tools with which in which you post, say, a text from ChatGPT online to detect whether it was AI generated, they aren't always 100% accurate. And a lot of research has shown that in cases where people whose language is not English isn't their first language, when you post a text from them, those detectors tend to associate it with AI generated as AI generated. So I think it's a field that's still sort of in progress. I don't know that there is a lot of literature about it, but I will let others answer.
Yeah, I think if all you know about AI is what you read in the news, which is dominated by press releases and things like that, I think there's a lot of benefit to AI companies in this perception that AI is kind of magic. I have this term that I cynically like to use, which is like just sprinkle some AI dust on it and it'll fix the problem, because that's how it's spoken about a lot. So I think I don't want to say like just be cynical, be critical of AI anytime anyone mentions it as a solution, but I think it's useful not to attribute the magical thinking towards AI. When I mentioned that we're using AI to help out with audio transcriptions, and a lot of times this is in conjunction with people who have in collections who are already transcribing audio recordings, either internally, or they're working with interns to do it, or they're paying vendors to do it. And in all of those cases, before any of those transcriptions go into the Smithsonian collections, some expert at some level will review those transcriptions. You should take the same approach with AI produced transcriptions. Review the output, look out for patterns, for things that will go wrong. So I think that yeah, avoiding that magical AI thinking that it's somehow better. It's really built on top of the biases in the data sets, and to be able to know when to spot those.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I'll give one last opportunity for audience questions. And if not, any final words from any of you? And then I'll pass it to Bridget.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone for the rich conversation. I was glued to my screen, listened to every single word. It was fascinating to hear from such diverse, but at the same time, kind of converging perspectives. I personally really enjoyed the conversation. So I want to thank again Mine and Mike and Bart and Suzanne for taking the time to join us in this conversation. I think the chat also speaks to how interesting the conversation was and how impressed everyone was with your contributions. What I wanted to say is that it's a very fast evolving technology. So I think this has been mentioned. And so it's very hard to kind of draw conclusions from our experiences so far and how those might inform the future, because so much of it is still in development. So it's really interesting to see how it can be used. It can have very practical uses already today, and we can only imagine how these uses could be expanded upon and developed further in ways that really support artists, that support institutions and their mission, that support communities of origin in reclaiming and developing their youth. And it also supports us, I think, as citizens, as we interrogate AI and how we learn to use it in ways that are critical, that are prone to review and comment and question the way that this technology has influence over the work that we do and our lives. I'll end here. I shared in the chat the link to the YouTube channel where this recording will be shared. We'll also be sharing a very short summary of this conversation on our blog very soon, so keep an eye out for this. And I think that's going to be goodbye for me. And thanks again to Jocelyn for the preparation and moderating this excellent webinar. Thank you very much. Bye.